I never thought a simple summer photography class would lead to the most haunting experience of my life. But looking back now, 15 years later, I can trace everything back to that humid June morning when I first met Ilari-chan. I was 16, desperately trying to find my place in the world. Photography seemed like a safe bet. Hide behind the lens instead of facing people directly. The community center offered a 6-week course, and my parents were happy to see me doing something other than playing video games in my basement. There were 12 of us in the class, but Ilari stood out immediately. She had this intense way of looking at things, like she was trying to memorize every detail of whatever caught her attention. While the rest of us fumbled with our cameras, she handled her old Polaroid with practiced ease. Her photos were different too. They had this unsettling quality that our instructor, Mr. Barrett, called provocative. We became friends, sort of. The kind of friendship that exists in the spaces between other relationships. Neither of us had many close friends, so we gravitated toward each other during class breaks and photo walks. Ilari would tell me about her theories on capturing true moments, those split seconds when people weren't aware they were being watched. That's when you see who they really are, she'd say, her dark eyes focused on something in the distance. When the masks come off. About 3 weeks into the course, Ilari invited me to help her with a special project. She said she needed an assistant to document life in transition around our small town. I agreed, partly out of curiosity and partly because I had nothing better to do. We started meeting after class, wandering through neighborhoods with our cameras. Ilari insisted on using her Polaroid exclusively, saying digital cameras stripped away the soul of an image. She had this old messenger bag that she kept her growing collection in, carefully organized in manila envelopes. The first sign that something was off came when I noticed she was taking photos of the same house repeatedly. It was a modest 2-story colonial with blue shutters on Maple Street. When I asked her about it, she just shrugged and said she was tracking the changes. Then I started noticing other patterns. She had multiple photos of certain people, a red-haired woman who jogged every morning, an elderly man who walked his German shepherd, a teenage boy who delivered newspapers. Always candid shots, always when they weren't looking. It's like a study, she explained when I finally worked up the courage to ask. Everyone has patterns, routines. If you watch long enough, you can predict exactly where they'll be, what they'll do. It's fascinating. The way she said fascinating made my skin crawl. One afternoon, while Ilari was busy photographing a mother and child at the playground, I snuck a peek inside her messenger bag. The manila envelopes were labeled with names and dates. Inside each one were dozens of Polaroids, arranged chronologically, some spanning weeks, others months. But it was the notes on the backs of the photos that really disturbed me. Detailed observations about daily schedules, habits, relationships, who visited these people, when they left for work, what time they turned their lights off at night. Ilari wasn't just documenting, she was surveilling. I found an envelope with my name on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. The photos started from before our class began. Me walking to school, sitting in my backyard, getting into my mom's car. All moments I never knew were being captured. The notes were even more chilling. Show signs of isolation. Easily manipulated. Perfect subject for next phase. I carefully put everything back and made an excuse to leave early. That night, I could barely sleep. I kept thinking about all those people, unknowingly starring in Ilari's twisted photo collection. But what did she mean by next phase? The next day, I didn't go to class. Or the day after. My mom was surprised. I'd been so enthusiastic about the course before. I made up excuses about not feeling well. Then the Polaroids started showing up in our mailbox. One each day, showing me in various moments from the previous 24 hours. On the back of each one, a single word. Missing you. I finally told my parents everything. They were horrified and immediately called the police. When the officers searched Ilari's house, they found an entire room dedicated to her project. The walls were covered with Polaroids, hundreds of them, connected by red string like some detective's evidence board. But Ilari was gone. The investigation revealed disturbing details. Ilari-chan wasn't even her real name. The family that everyone thought was hers? Paid actors, hired to help establish her cover story. The police found evidence linking her to similar projects in 3 other states. Most unsettling were the items missing from some of the homes she'd photographed, small things the owners hadn't even noticed: a coffee mug, a hairbrush, a child's toy. Trophies, the police called them. They never found her. The case went cold after a few months. Life slowly returned to normal, or something close to it. I gave up photography and spent my remaining high school years trying to convince myself that I was safe, that it was all over. Until last week, I was going through some old boxes in my parents' attic when I found a manila envelope I didn't recognize. Inside was a single Polaroid, obviously recent, showing me packing boxes in my new apartment, the one I'd moved into just 2 months ago. On the back, in familiar handwriting, "Ready for the next phase?" Below that was a USB drive. I should have turned it over to the police immediately, but curiosity, or maybe something darker, made me plug it in. It contained thousands of photos, spanning the 15 years since Eilary disappeared. Photos of me graduating high school, going to college, at my first job, on dates, at my wedding. Every major moment of my life, and countless small ones in between, all captured without my knowledge. But it was the last folder that made my blood run cold. It was labeled "The Others" and contained photos of everyone else from that summer photography class. All of us, documented through the years, our lives caught in Eilary's lens without our knowledge. We weren't just subjects. We were her collection. The most recent photo in my folder was taken yesterday. I'm sitting at my desk, writing this very story. The note on the back reads, "Telling tales? Don't worry. Soon everyone will understand our art." I'm writing this as a warning, but also as a confession. Because the truth is, ever since finding that USB drive, I've caught myself looking at people differently, noticing their patterns, thinking about how easy it would be to document their lives without them knowing. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see the world through Eilary's lens. And sometimes, this is the part that terrifies me most, I understand exactly what she meant about capturing true moments. Last night, I bought a Polaroid camera. I tell myself it's for protection, that I need to document everything in case she's planning something. But deep down, I wonder if this is what she wanted all along. To make me see the world the way she does. To turn me into someone like her. The camera sits on my desk as I write this, its lens like an unblinking eye. Next to it is a manila envelope, still empty, waiting to be filled. And somewhere out there, Eilary is watching, her shutter clicking, capturing this moment for her collection. I know she's waiting for me to take that first photo, to start my own collection, to complete the transformation she began 15 years ago. The scariest part? I'm starting to think I want to. This morning, I found a note in my mailbox. No photo this time, just 5 words that made my heart stop. Your turn to teach someone else. Attached was a list of names, the students enrolled in next month's photography course at the community center. The Polaroid feels heavy in my hands as I write this. Outside, the sun is setting, casting long shadows that seem perfect for capturing those true moments Eilary always talked about. I should throw the camera away, call the police, warn those students. Instead, I'm checking the battery and loading film. Because now I understand what Eilary meant about masks, about seeing people as they really are. And once you start seeing the world this way, through the predator's lens, you can never go back to being prey. So if you're reading this, and you notice someone watching you, someone with a camera always ready, remember, not all collections are meant to be found. Some are meant to grow. Click. Growing up in a family of competitive gamers wasn't always easy, but it had its perks. While other families spent their holidays at beach resorts or theme parks, the Blackwood clan had a different tradition, the annual tournament. Every year, during the week between Christmas and New Year's, all 37 members of my extended family would gather at a different location for what could only be described as the most intense gaming competition you've ever seen. This year was special. I had just turned 21, which meant I could finally participate in the nighttime events. Up until now, I'd been relegated to the daytime competitions, chess tournaments, video game marathons, and elaborate scavenger hunts. But the night games? Those were legendary among the younger cousins. We'd hear stories about them for years, but the adults kept the details surprisingly vague. The location this year was a sprawling estate in northern Maine, a Victorian mansion surrounded by acres of dense forest. The property belonged to some tech millionaire who rented it out during the winter months. My uncle Jerome, who organized this year's event, had spent months preparing everything. Listen up, everyone. Jerome's voice boomed through the mansion's grand hall on the night of December 29th. All the adult family members, myself included, gathered around him. The younger cousins had already been sent to bed, supervised by our eldest Aunt Martha, who had retired from the competitions years ago. Jerome pulled out what looked like a modified paintball mask with various electronic attachments. This year's night game is called Digital Hunt. Each of you will wear one of these masks, equipped with augmented reality displays and motion sensors. Your objective is to collect digital tokens scattered throughout the forest while avoiding being tagged by other players. He went on to explain the rules. The masks would display a map showing token locations and other players within a 50-meter radius. Each player started with 3 lives. Getting tagged meant losing a life, and losing all 3 meant elimination. The last person standing, or the player with the most tokens at 3 a.m., would win the grand prize, a vintage gaming console collection worth thousands of dollars. One more thing, Jerome added, his expression turning serious. The forest is large, and it's easy to get lost. Each mask has a panic button. Press it 3 times quickly, and it will alert everyone to your location. Use it only in emergencies. As we suited up, I noticed my cousin Sarah looking nervous. She was 2 years older than me, but had always been the cautious type. First time? I asked, helping her adjust her mask. Yeah, she replied. I qualified last year but chickened out. Something about running around in the woods at night just feels wrong. I understood her concern, but the excitement coursing through my veins overshadowed any apprehension. The masks were surprisingly comfortable, and the augmented reality display was crystal clear, showing a detailed map of the surrounding area with glowing dots representing tokens. At exactly midnight, Jerome fired a flare into the sky, and the game began. Most players immediately rushed into the forest, but I held back, watching their movements on my display. The smart play, I figured, was to let them thin each other out while I collected tokens from the periphery. The first hour went smoothly. I managed to collect 6 tokens while avoiding any confrontation. The night was clear but cold, and the snow crunched beneath my boots as I moved from tree to tree. The forest was eerily beautiful at night, with moonlight filtering through the bare branches and creating intricate shadows on the snow. Around 1 a.m., I noticed something odd. My display showed a player moving in a strange pattern, zigzagging through the trees about 40 meters to my left. They weren't heading toward any tokens, and their movement seemed erratic. Curious, I decided to investigate, keeping to the shadows of the larger trees. As I got closer, I realized the figure wasn't wearing one of our masks. Instead, they wore what looked like night vision goggles and carried some sort of device. My heart rate spiked. This wasn't part of the game. I quickly backed away, but my foot caught on a hidden root, causing me to stumble. The figure's head snapped in my direction. For a moment, we both stood frozen. Then they started moving toward me with deliberate speed. I turned and ran, no longer caring about stealth. My display showed 3 other players nearby, and I headed in their direction. Behind me, I could hear the crunch of snow getting closer. The stranger was fast, much faster than someone should be able to move through a dark forest. Suddenly, my display flickered and went dark. The mask's electronics had failed completely. Panicked, I ripped it off and continued running blindly through the trees. The moonlight was now my only guide, and shadows seemed to move and twist around me. A branch whipped across my face, drawing blood, but I didn't slow down. I could hear multiple sets of footsteps now, coming from different directions. My lungs burned from the cold air, and my legs felt like lead, but pure adrenaline kept me going. I burst into a small clearing and nearly collided with my cousin Derek. He had his mask off and was looking around wildly. "They're not part of the game," he gasped. "There's at least 4 of them." Before I could respond, a high-pitched tone pierced the night, causing both of us to cover our ears. My vision blurred, and I felt dizzy. Through watering eyes, I saw dark figures emerging from the trees around us. They moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost gliding over the snow. "Run!" Derek shouted, shoving me toward the gap between two of the figures. I sprinted through, hearing him close behind me. The strange tone continued, seeming to come from everywhere at once. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The mansion's lights appeared through the trees, and I could hear voices calling out. Jerome and several others were standing on the back patio, armed with actual rifles. Our family's enthusiasm for gaming was only matched by their love of firearms. As we reached the edge of the forest, the tones suddenly stopped. Jerome and my father rushed forward to meet us, guns raised toward the trees. Other family members were emerging from different directions, many without their masks, all looking terrified. "Inside now," Jerome ordered, firing several shots into the air. No one argued. We hurried into the mansion, and Jerome immediately initiated a head count. 3 people were missing: Sarah, my Uncle Marcus, and Cousin Pete. Just as Jerome was organizing search parties, we heard screaming from outside. Sarah burst through the door, half carrying, half dragging Pete. Both were covered in snow and shaking uncontrollably. Marcus followed a moment later, clutching his arm, which had a deep gash running from elbow to wrist. "There's more of them in the forest," Marcus gasped. "They've got some kind of technology I've never seen before. They were studying us, like we were some kind of experiment." Jerome immediately called the police, but by the time they arrived 2 hours later, there was no sign of the intruders. The only evidence we found were strange geometric patterns carved into several trees, and all of our masks had been seemingly fried by whatever signal had generated that tone. The police investigation turned up nothing concrete. The property's security cameras had all failed during the exact hours of our game, and the few footprints we could find seemed to vanish at random points, as if their owners had simply disappeared. In the days that followed, family members reported strange experiences: electronic devices malfunctioning, unexplained lights in the sky above their homes, and a persistent feeling of being watched. Jerome received an anonymous email containing only a series of binary numbers which, when decoded, spelled out, "Thank you for participating." The annual tournament tradition continued, but we never played night games again. Some family members drifted away, too traumatized by what had happened. Others became obsessed with finding explanations, diving deep into research about experimental technology and government programs. As for me, I still love gaming, but I stick to well-lit rooms and traditional consoles now. Sometimes, late at night, I'll hear that high-pitched tone in my dreams, and I'll wake up with the unshakable feeling that somewhere in the dark, someone, or something, is still playing their own version of our game. But the strangest part? Last week, exactly 1 year after that night, every family member who participated received the same text message from an unknown number. "Ready for round 2? I deleted the message immediately, but I couldn't help noticing that it was sent at exactly midnight, and my phone's display showed no signal at the time it was received. Some games, I've learned, are better left unplayed. I've always been more of a planner than a spontaneous person, which is why it surprised everyone when I agreed to Sarah's last-minute vacation idea. We had been dating for just over a year, and she constantly teased me about my need to have everything scheduled weeks in advance. But when she showed me the listing for an old lighthouse keeper's house on the Oregon coast, something about it just called to me. "Come on, James," she had said, her eyes sparkling with excitement as she scrolled through the photos on her laptop. "The place is available next week, and it's way under our budget. How often do you get to stay in a real lighthouse?" The property wasn't actually in the lighthouse itself, but rather in the keeper's house adjacent to it. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago, but the Victorian-style house had been lovingly maintained and converted into a vacation rental. The photos showed a cozy interior with period furniture, a wood-burning fireplace, and windows that offered panoramic views of the Pacific Ocean. I found myself nodding before I could even think it through. "Let's do it," I said, surprising both of us. Sarah immediately called our friends Mike and Rachel, a couple we often hung out with. They were both teachers like Sarah, which meant they had the same spring break free. Within an hour, the trip was booked, and I was already wondering if I had made a mistake by not researching the property more thoroughly. The drive up the coast was beautiful, though increasingly remote. We left Portland late Friday afternoon in Mike's SUV, watching as the suburbs gave way to dense forests and occasional glimpses of the ocean. The GPS signal became spotty as we wound our way along coastal roads, but the property owner's directions were detailed enough to get us there. The sun was setting by the time we turned onto the private road leading to the lighthouse. The gravel path wound through a thick grove of wind-bent pines before opening up to reveal our destination. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its beam already rotating steadily above us. The keeper's house beside it was exactly as pictured. A two-story Victorian painted a faded white with dark blue trim. "This is incredible," Rachel said, pressing her face against the car window. "Look at that view." The house sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, with nothing but water visible to the horizon. The closest town was about 20 miles back, and we hadn't passed another house for at least 5 miles. The isolation felt peaceful rather than threatening, at least initially. The property manager, Mrs. Henderson, was waiting for us on the wraparound porch. She was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, wearing a weathered raincoat despite the clear weather. "You made good time," she said, though none of us had told her when we were leaving Portland. "I've got the house all ready for you. Just a few things to go over before I head back to town." She led us through the house, pointing out various features. The antique furnishings we weren't to touch, the temperamental heating system, the emergency landline since cell service was spotty at best. The house was beautiful in an old-fashioned way, with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and large windows in every room. "Now, about the lighthouse," Mrs. Henderson said, her tone becoming more serious. "It's still operational, of course, and while the lower level is included in your rental, the upper levels are strictly off-limits. The door to the tower will be locked, and I must insist you don't try to access it. For liability reasons," she added quickly. We all nodded, though I caught Mike and Sarah exchanging a disappointed look. I knew they had been hoping to climb to the top. "One more thing," Mrs. Henderson said as she headed for the door. "If you hear any unusual sounds at night, it's just the wind. These old houses make all sorts of noises, especially this close to the ocean. Nothing to worry about." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Before any of us could ask what she meant by unusual sounds, she was gone, her car disappearing down the gravel road faster than seemed safe in the growing darkness. The first few hours were fantastic. We unpacked, chose our rooms. Sarah and I took the master bedroom with the ocean view, while Mike and Rachel took the slightly smaller room facing the lighthouse, and prepared dinner in the surprisingly well-equipped kitchen. We opened a bottle of wine and gathered in the living room, where Mike got a fire going in the old fireplace. "This place is perfect," Sarah said, curled up next to me on the antique sofa. "I can't believe we got it for such a good price, especially during spring break." "Maybe because it's so remote," Rachel suggested. "Most spring breakers probably want to be closer to civilization. Or maybe because it's haunted," Mike said with an exaggerated wink, taking another sip of wine. We all laughed, but there was something slightly forced about it. The house did have a certain atmosphere as night fell, not necessarily threatening, but definitely present. The rotating beam from the lighthouse created strange moving shadows through the windows, and the wind had picked up, making the old house creak and groan. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. Sarah and I had just gotten into bed when we heard it, a sound that definitely wasn't the wind. "Did you hear that?" Sarah whispered, gripping my arm. I nodded, sitting up to listen more carefully. It was a metallic scratching sound, like someone dragging something heavy across a metal surface. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the lighthouse. "It's probably just the mechanism that rotates the light," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The sound came again, louder this time, followed by what could only be described as a long, low moan. Sarah's fingernails dug into my arm. "James, that's not machinery." We heard footsteps in the hallway. Mike and Rachel had obviously heard it too. I opened our bedroom door to find them standing there, both looking pale. "You guys heard that, right?" Mike asked. Before anyone could respond, there was a loud bang from downstairs, like something heavy falling over. Rachel let out a small scream. "We should check it out," I said, though every instinct was telling me to grab Sarah and run for the car. The four of us crept downstairs, Mike holding his phone as a flashlight. The living room was exactly as we'd left it, but it felt different somehow, colder, despite the lingering warmth from the fireplace. The scratching sound came again, definitely from the direction of the lighthouse. "Look," Sarah whispered, pointing to the window. Through the glass, we could see that the door to the lighthouse tower was open, swinging slightly in the wind. The same door Mrs. Henderson had assured us would be locked. "Maybe the wind blew it open," Rachel suggested. But we all knew the door had been securely locked when we arrived. Mike, always the brave one, headed for the door that connected the house to the lighthouse. "We should at least close it before the wind damages something." "Mike, don't," Rachel pleaded, but he was already turning the handle. The connecting door opened into a small room at the base of the lighthouse. The spiral staircase leading up to the light room was barely visible in the beam from Mike's phone. The open door to the outside was causing a draft that made the air feel even colder than it was. Mike stepped into the lighthouse, and that's when everything went wrong. The connecting door slammed shut behind him with enough force to shake the walls. Rachel screamed and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. We could hear Mike shouting and pounding on the other side. Then the lights went out. Not just the house lights. The lighthouse beam went dark too, plunging everything into absolute darkness. Sarah fumbled for her phone, but like mine, it had no signal and the flashlight function wasn't working. The scratching sound was all around us now, accompanied by what sounded like whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Rachel was still trying desperately to open the door while Mike's shouts became more panicked. Suddenly, his shouting stopped. "Mike!" Rachel called out, her voice breaking. "Mike, answer me." The silence that followed was deafening. Then we heard footsteps, slow, heavy footsteps, coming down the spiral staircase inside the lighthouse. They didn't sound like Mike's. Sarah grabbed my hand. "We need to get out of here. Now." We ran for the front door, but the handle wouldn't turn. The windows wouldn't open either. It was as if everything had been sealed shut. We were trapped. The footsteps reached the bottom of the lighthouse stairs. Something started pushing against the connecting door, making it bend inward slightly with each thrust. Rachel backed away, tears streaming down her face. In desperation, I ran to the kitchen and grabbed the largest knife I could find. Sarah and Rachel huddled behind me as we faced the door, watching in horror as the wood began to splinter. Just as the door seemed about to give way, all the lights came back on, including the lighthouse beam. The pressure on the door stopped. The scratching sounds and whispers ceased. We heard a key turning in the front door. Mrs. Henderson stood in the doorway, looking unsurprised to find us terrified in the kitchen at 2 a.m. Behind her, looking dazed but unhurt, was Mike. "I thought I told you the lighthouse was off limits," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice stern but not unkind. What just happened?" Sarah managed to ask. Mrs. Henderson sighed. The original lighthouse keeper, Mr. Harrison, was very dedicated to his job. Some might say too dedicated. When they automated the lighthouse in 1963, he refused to leave. They found him at the top of the tower a week later. The official cause of death was exposure, but she trailed off. Every few years, someone tries to go into the tower at night. Mr. Harrison doesn't like that. He's very protective of his lighthouse. Mike was pale but composed. "I don't remember much after the door closed," he said. "Just a feeling of intense cold, and someone whispering that I needed to leave. Then I was outside with Mrs. Henderson." "You're lucky," Mrs. Henderson said. "Mr. Harrison was feeling generous tonight. He usually—" She stopped herself. "Well, never mind about that. I suggest you all get some sleep. In the house, not the lighthouse. Mr. Harrison won't bother you there." She left before we could ask any more questions. We spent the rest of the night huddled together in the living room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. None of us went near the lighthouse door again. The rest of our stay was uneventful, though we couldn't help noticing that the lighthouse beam seemed to follow us whenever we were outside. We cut our trip short, leaving Sunday morning instead of staying through Monday as planned. As we drove away, I looked back one last time. A figure stood at the top of the lighthouse, just visible through the glass. It raised its hand in what might have been a wave, or might have been a warning. Mrs. Henderson never charged us for the shortened stay. When I checked the rental listing a week later, Curious about whether she would mention the incident to future renters, the property was no longer available. The website showed only an error message. The lighthouse keeper's property is no longer accepting guests. Sometimes, late at night, I look up old news articles about the lighthouse. I found one from 1963 about the death of the keeper, Thomas Harrison. The article included a photo. The figure I saw waving from the tower looked exactly like him. Sarah and I are still together, and we still take vacations, but we stick to well-reviewed hotels now. Mike and Rachel got married last year, but they chose a mountain venue for their honeymoon. None of us have any interest in staying near a lighthouse again. As for Mrs. Henderson, I tried to find her a few months after our stay, wanting to ask her more about what happened that night. The Historical Society in the nearest town told me they'd never heard of her. According to their records, the lighthouse keeper's house has been abandoned since 1963. I don't know what really happened that night, or who Mrs. Henderson was, or why the lighthouse keeper's spirit remains so devoted to his post even decades after his death. But I do know that some places aren't meant for vacation rentals, and some properties have permanent residents who don't show up in the listings. If you're ever browsing vacation rentals and see an old lighthouse keeper's house available for an unusually low price, my advice would be to keep scrolling. Some deals are too good to be true, and some properties come with extra guests who aren't mentioned in the reviews. And if you do find yourself near an old lighthouse at night, pay attention to any warnings you receive, especially from elderly property managers who appear out of nowhere and disappear just as quickly. They might just be trying to save your life. Well, creepy companions, that was the last of our 3 terrifying tales for tonight. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling stories, don't forget to hit that like button. It helps keep the scary stories coming and keeps the dark forces at bay. And if you want to hear more creepy tales like these, make sure to subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell. You never know when the next horrifying story might appear in your feed. Speaking of which, let me know in the comments which of tonight's 3 stories scared you the most. Was it the mysterious figures in the woods? The protective lighthouse keeper's spirit? Or perhaps the final revelation about the property manager who was never there?